I had a copy of My Generation by The Who in my collection. And it was one of the newer, well, it was an American version, and actually it was a double LP with Magic Bus and My Generation. And like a nerd, when I was bored, I look up on Discogs and see what people are talking about this album. And I read about a reissue from 1980 in Germany, or they reissued it in all of Europe. And I think that's the current reissue we have now in the United States with My Generation. But anyway, at the time in 1980, it was reissued in a mono format. And everybody was like, oh my gosh, you have to get this album. The sound, the energy, the vibe, it's just like, boom, getting hit in the face. So I set out on a journey to find me a copy. Eventually, I did. This here, The Who, My Generation. It was their first album that came out in 1965. This is one of those 1980 mono represses that are incredibly sonically fantastic. And listening to this, it just made me want to go back and look what was going on with The Who at this time. Why does this record sound so good? And the funny thing is, in the process of checking this out and enjoying it, I started noticing some weird things, and one of which was right after this album was released in 1965. Remember, this was The Who's first album. They had only put out 2 singles before this. And this came out in December, I think it was December 3rd, 1965. It was strange because in America, it came out in April, the following April in 1966. I don't remember the exact date, but they put a different cover on it and gave it a different name. This is just The Who, My Generation. In America, I'll put one up here on the screen. It was The Who Sings My Generation. It had a different cover. But the strange thing was, right after this album came out, they were involved in some legal problems with the producer. And this album was only in print in Europe for 1966. Sorry, 1965. The remaining bits sold off in 66. Never saw another copy until these babies came out in 1980. The American one stayed in print through the 60s, but same type of thing. They kind of dropped off, and then I think came back in the late 80s after this was reissued in the 80s. But I got off on a tangent on that. Let's talk about this record. Did I mention when this record was released in 1966 in the US, it came out the same day as Beatles' Rubber Soul? All right, so we have some competition about this time. But we're talking about this baby right here. And I highly recommend, I have not heard those new reissues, but if you can find one of these 1980 reissue mono copies, and I know that's all Record Talk nerd stuff, buy it. Put it on your stereo and listen. And, well, it's as corny as it sounds, and feel the power. This album, hearing this version, man, it makes a world of difference. The Who, in 1965, 1966, they had to have been just animals. The energy it's just crazy. You know, this album, I want to say, hearing this version, it's a stupid thing to say these days, but this album is almost punk rock. It presaged the Stooges. It presaged anybody else you want to say was punk. And its energy and its rawness and its sound and its speed in the sense of all the songs on here. There's 12 songs on this record. 9 of them are under 2 minutes. 2 of them are in the 3-minute range, and 1 song breaks 4 minutes. That's pretty punk rock. It's about 35 minutes in total, 17 minutes each side, give or take. Lots of songs, hitting you hard and fast. The energy is just amazing. But let's get into this, right? I want to talk about this, and I just took this long way around to what is it? Tell a short story long is what I just did. But let's get to the point and talk about why this album is great and is kicking my butt these days. All right? The Who, My Generation. Let me just mention this. The day it was released, when this record came out, in 1965, The Who, on the day of its release, played 2 gigs. They went to like a special release gig and played a show, and then they went to, I think it was called the Goldhawks Social Club there in London, to play like a big celebratory gig for being able to release this record. And in the crowd that night was the Italian director, what's his name, Michelangelo Antonioni, is that right? Anyway, the guy who did Blow Up, he had gone the day this record was released, when the Who were playing that gig. He had read about the Who and about Pete's energy and whatnot, so he had gone to this gig to see the Who in action because he wanted to put them in his upcoming film Blow Up, which I believe came out in '66, was it? Somewhere around there. You guys seen that movie? Well, there's a famous scene in there with the Yardbirds where they smash their instruments and they're trying to act all like they're all, mean and tough. He got that idea from the Who, and he had wanted to talk to Pete about it, but they had a falling out immediately, probably after the gig. So it never happened, so he ended up using the Yardbirds. But the Who were the basis for that famous scene in Blow Up. Now, I got to tell you, in 1967, Robert Christgau, who was the critic for the Village Voice, the music critic, said that this was the hardest rock in history. At that time, it is, and we'll get into that, or it was, and we'll get into that in a few minutes. But let's talk about this, baby. This record, they'd only done 2 singles prior to this, and actually, Pete Townshend said this record was recorded in 6 hours. 6 hours for one of the biggest, most important debuts in rock and roll history. One of the most raw debuts. In fact, let me stop there. I keep digressing, but that's the way it goes sometimes. You match this, listen to this compared to the Beatles' debut. Tell me who's got it. Listen to this, listen to this next to the Stones' debut, and tell me who's the man. This, kids, pure rock and roll energy. No one was taking American, and that's what was cool about this album. They were taking American R&B, the vibe, the sound, and there are a couple American R&B songs on here. And just giving it that, just pumping it, just making it so raw and in your face. It's amazing. I don't know how, sorry, I keep going on about it, but it's true. Give it a listen. But anyway, the album, Pete said, was recorded in only 6 hours over a few different scattered sessions. And, there was some mixed feelings about it. Looking back, the band weren't too crazy about it. Pete had said, basically, it wasn't their stage show or anything, but they had rehearsed the album enough so that they just went in, recorded it, and in Pete's words, he said, put it on the plate, just boom. And Pete also said around the same time after the album came out, he wasn't worried about quality. What he was more interested in was production and just keeping things moving. And when you listen to this record, man, you can tell there's some serious movement going on. It's also weird if you think about when I was comparing it to some of the others. When this came out, compared to some of the other records that are out at that time, Dylan's Blonde on Blonde, Pet Sounds, come on, we know who's going to kick ass on that one. The Stones' Aftermath was out around this time. Revolver, come on. This takes the cake. Few weird bits when I was listening to this and enjoying it. I noticed a crazy thing, right? There's 12 songs on here. 9 of them, yes, there's 12 songs on here. 9 of them are Pete Townshend originals, and 3 of them are covers. And 2 of those covers were James Brown songs. Back in '65, '66, doing music press, at the time Roger Daltrey said they weren't really keen about putting the James Brown cover songs on because that was more of what they were doing at that time, playing live in the clubs. But they didn't necessarily want to put those kind of R&B songs and cover versions on their debut album. They wanted to show that they are their own band. And a lot of people think this record was key about the mod movement. right? But actually, Pete, Roger, the other guys, they'll all tell you they were done with the mod thing when My Generation came out. It was recorded during their whole maximum R&B phase, sure, during 64, but by the time the album was finished and out, they had moved on. They were on to a new phase. As Pete said, they weren't worried about quality, just keep it moving, production and movement. So now by the time you see this, and by the cover, you can tell they were out of the mod and into the pop art thing. These 12 songs blazing on the stereo, blowing up. Pete's roommate at the time, Barney, I forgot his name, Richard Barnes, I think they called him Barney, his college roommate at the time, it said something like, they were taking pop and blues at this time when this album was being recorded, playing all those clubs, and they were combining this pop and R&B in such an aggressive and really an almost physical way that it was shocking. Like, to see him live was shocking. And there was nobody else like these guys around at the time. One thing that stood out to me is the energy on this record. And you got to listen. Like I keep saying it, but listen to the energy on this record. And the other thing that stood out to me, we all know Pete for what? For being a guitar hero. But the thing that really struck me when I was listening to this the other day was there's a real lack of solos on this record. But what is there in the energy is feedback, rawness, lots of bass, and lots of piano. That's Nicky Hopkins who sat in and played with The Who on this. But it's strange to think that Townsend is such a guitar god and there's such a lack of solos on here. Not even on the single My Generation, if you think about it. There's no guitar solo, but there's a bass solo, but no guitar solo. In fact, I discovered in my own nerdy way, sitting and listening to this, the only two solos on this record are on the two James Brown songs. And I think he does a little bit of noodling on the Bo Diddley track. But on every Pete Townsend Who original, no guitar solo. It's crazy. But then I was reading an old interview in 1966 with Townsend, and it made perfect sense. At the time they did this record, well, there was a lot going on within the band and in the scene and the fashion scene and, you know, the London music scene and whatever. But Pete, in this interview, I believe it was with Record Mirror at the time in 1966, said he could play guitar as well as most guitarists on the scene, but he didn't specialize, but his specialty was, Pete said he could play guitar as anyone else, any other guitarist there on the scene, but his specialty was playing big chords and very loud. And then it has nothing to do with music, it's more about volume and impact. It's so true after reading when he said that in 1966, that he was saying right then and there, I'm about big chords and volume and impact. And if you think about it, what is he doing when he does that? It's hitting chords. He's not sitting there noodling, being a nerd. It's those big chords. It's those big power chords. Amazing to think that this record and some classic tunes on here have no solos. No solos. Go back and listen. It is truly amazing. That's just really crazy. So at that time, like I just mentioned a minute ago, there was a lot of tension going on in the band around this time. In fact, before the record came out, late in the fall of 1965, the Who were on tour doing a European tour, and they were in Denmark. And Pete had said there was a lot of dope going on in the band, a lot of speed, you know what I mean? A lot of stuff, a lot of drinking, a lot of dope. And to be honest, the Who weren't friends. They weren't buddies. Townsend said he didn't like the other guys. And I don't think Roger liked the other guys. I don't know, but we'll address that in a minute. But anyway, it came to a head, supposedly over drugs, at a show in Denmark in Aarhus. And Roger Daltrey said that Pete made a move at him with his guitar. He clocked Pete, knocked him out cold, felt horrible, And a few minutes later, he's with his unconscious bandmate in the back of a hospital, in the back of an ambulance going to the hospital holding his hand. For all intents and purposes, Roger was fired. He was thrown out of the band, but the band still had so many gigs lined up and, responsibilities, things already booked, that they had to ask Roger back temporarily to fill in his own shoes to see what would happen. And Roger said for the rest of 65 and into 66, he felt like he was walking on eggshells, like he felt like I could lose this at any time. And he was afraid of that for a while too, he admits. But anyway, the tensions that were going on in the band made for some of this. Pete said that he was actually trying to write for Roger because Roger sang differently and thought differently, and they weren't buddies, and so they had different ideas. Pete might want to be writing songs for himself, but he had to stop and think, I need to write for this dude who's going to sing my songs. And in fact, in the process during 65, it could have been a little bit before that, their manager, Kit Lambert, or one of their managers, actually took Pete out of his college dorm or away from his flat that he shared with his college roommate with Barney that I mentioned, and put him in a place in Belgravia. His managers had bought him some new speakers, some special tape recorders and whatever, and they moved him to a different part of London and said, here kid, start recording, write some cool stuff or whatever. And Pete said he was really lonely because all he had was this band that he didn't like, these guys that he would just fight with. In fact, Pete had said that the band were just horrifying, literally horrifying people that he hated to be around. And his lonely little studio, he didn't have his best bud from college anymore. He just had his living room with equipment in it. And so he had to set about and start writing. In 65, in an interview in 65, prior to the release of the album, Pete said that it's that clashing personalities that they had which gave the stage show so much energy and, dynamics, that they hated each other and there was so much tension that they would get on stage and they had to get it out somehow. So playing it in the music, that was not a put on, that was literal pent up frustration that they were all getting out in their own way so they didn't end up in a fight every night after a gig. And Roger basically said the same thing. Like they would go on the stage, take their aggression up there and just let it all out. And that made for a dynamic show and some super dynamic music. But one funny thing about that, before they actually had the whole album out, everybody also had, not only did they not get along, but they all had different music tastes. And Roger had made some comment somewhere along the way that he was afraid to go in and start recording for the album because Keith kind of liked wimpy pop music, and he was a big Beach Boys fan, so he was really into the Beach Boys. And John, the bass player, was really into stuff like Dwayne Eddy and this twangy guitar music, and he said he was just scared to death to go in the studio and see what happened because Pete didn't like that stuff, he didn't like that stuff, so there was all this not only combating personalities that had to gel to make a record, but also all these combative musical styles. A perfect example, the last track on side 2, the Ox. What a noisy, complete mess, which, by the way, happened in the studio on the spot. It just sounds like a traffic jam. Probably the worst song on the album. Of course, the Ox. John Entwistle became known as the Ox. It's just a mess, so forget that. Let's talk about this now, the record. 12 songs, side 1, Out in the Street. You know, the first time I heard that, I was like, why does that sound so familiar? Because, think about it, the single, The Who's second single, think about that. Only 2 singles, then this record comes out. Boom, knockout punch. Fantastic. But anyway, Out in the Street, it kind of mimics, the guitar is almost an exact carbon copy of Anyway, Anyhow, Anywhere. So it sounds super familiar when I first heard that. But I love the way Roger just says, out. It's a great start to the album. And like I said, no solo. There was no solo there. Second song, I Don't Mind. That's one of those James Brown songs. And that's where you get one of the solos. In fact, that's the only solo on side one on the James Brown song. The Good's Gone, La 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 Lies. That came out as a single, actually. I forgot to mention The Good's Gone. That is the longest song on the album. La 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 Lies, that came out as the fourth single. There was some weird stuff going on after this album was done, like I said, with their producer. What was his name? Tammy. I can't remember the guy's name, and it's not on here. But he produced the Kinks as well, and even the Damned. What's his name? Mel? Whatever. But he had the rights to the songs. The Who didn't, or something like that, or Decca. They had signed to Decca. They were trying to get signed to Decca. So there was a real battle. That's why this record wasn't in print for 14, 15, 16 years after its initial release. Once it sold out, that was it. But also, Shell or Mel or whatever his name is, he would release singles from this album to compete with actually new songs that The Who were releasing in late 65, 66. And sometimes it would have two Who songs on the chart, which is good, but sometimes the songs from this record wouldn't have placed as good because they were battling a brand new single that The Who had been put out. And La La Lies was one of them. It was the fourth single. There were 4 singles taken from this. That was the last single to come off of this record. Much Too Much, it's all right song. Let's talk a bit about My Generation now. Title track, that was The Who's 3rd single and the first single for this album. Now, a lot's going on with My Generation. Of course, it's a huge song. I think the punks, you could say, kind of even took it as one of their own, that it was a calling card, a rallying cry for even punks. But My Generation, the name of the album and the single, supposedly, according to rock and roll lore, Pete wrote that on a train, humming in his head Mose Allison's Young Man Blues, which is on Who Live at Leeds. Check that out. Great version of that. But anyway, he had based the song on that. Now, there's all sorts of, stories when they were recording it. Where did the stuttering come in? Why did the stuttering happen? And in fact, the BBC banned it when it was first released because they were afraid that Roger's stuttering would offend those who actually did stutter. Another weird point about this track is, again, no guitar solo. Go back and listen. But I think, technically, it is the first rock and roll / pop single to get in the charts that featured a bass solo. So it's strange. A bass solo is on such a huge song for The Who, but no guitar solo. Think about that. I think it's weird. A few other strange things about this. When this single was released in 65, nobody was saying, I want to die before I get old. I hope I die before I get old. Which, by the way, Pete said, by the time this album came out, and especially the single, they had moved on. Like I said, they were done with that whole mod phase. They were into their whole pop art phase. And things had changed. The attitude had changed. And Pete had said that he was just concerned. He was scared. I don't even know how old he was at this time. 19 years old? How old is he? 20? I don't know. Or early 20s? But he said he was scared of just kind of being complacent and leading just a normal life, doing normal things, and that's it. He said he wouldn't mind growing old in like a Charlie Chaplin kind of way, or, a Picasso kind of way where you do all these great things and you're always experimenting, but to just be a normal guy and kind of lead a normal life, he was afraid of that. So that was the inspiration for that song. Another thing that was strange, or it's weird if you put it in context of why The Who kind of maybe came across very abrasive and kind of punky, is you have this, I hope I die before I get old, and at the same time the Stones are going, hey man, get off of my cloud. There was no real aggression like this. Before the punks saying F off, this was a guy just saying, man, I hope I die before I ever have to do anything like that. Like, this sucks. No one was saying that. The Beatles sure weren't saying that. Everybody's just namby-pambying around, and then Townsend comes out and punches you right in the nose. Insane! Now, some other stories that come around this song is, how did the stuttering happen? Well, remember, I keep saying there's that intertwined relationship between mods and the Who, right? They were leaving that scene. A lot of speed in the whole mod scene, right? Amphetamines and stuff. Pete says, the best that he can remember, he kind of wanted the stuttering, and he said it's in his demos, at his home demos, he was doing it to kind of mimic that scene, like just being so supercharged up, these mods that they can't talk. And so that's what Pete says, where he got the stutter from. Roger and the producer kind of have the same story too, and that goes a bit different. Roger said he didn't remember, or he vaguely remembers or something like that about hearing it on Pete's original demo. But the producer said something to the effect of, Roger went in, and Roger said he didn't rehearse before he went in to sing this song. He just goes in to sing, and as he's singing, it was just this natural flub that just, to get the words out because he wasn't following them properly or whatever the case was. And they thought, wow, that's a happy accident. Play it up. And they kept it in for the song. Is that true? I don't know. But overall, Pete said, at the time that song was written, by the time it had come out, they had moved on. So what's done is done. We're on to something else. Side 2, let's get into this. This is taking a while. Kids Are All Right. Another massive song for the Who. A calling card, so to speak. Made a movie about it, and the soundtrack album, which was really popular in the 70s about it. Great tune. That was the third single from this album, and the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame actually claims it to be one of the 500 most important, or 500 songs that shaped rock and roll. Great tune. Please, 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 the other James Brown cover on side 2. Weird. Think about it. James Brown, second song on side 1. James Brown, second song on side 2. Crazy. Just for those keeping score, Please, Please, Please was James Brown's first single. It's not true. That's all right. I'm not crazy about it, but whatever. I'm a Man, the Bo Diddley song. I think one of the things was the BBC, they may have, if I remember right, even banned that initially because they thought it had sexual innuendos and they didn't want none of that monkey business going on. And I think that's why they changed it and left it off the American album when it came out that following April. They replaced it with something else, if I remember right. But that's the third cover on here, the Bo Diddley, I'm a Man. Then we have A Legal Matter, which Townsend did. Oh, that's another thing I forgot to mention. During this time when they were recording, some of these topics, like that song, may have been a little bit touchy for Roger because he was going through a divorce at that time. And because of that, it's rumored that's why Pete sang it. This is the first time Pete ever sang on a record. He didn't sing on any of the other singles or any of the other songs. First time is A Legal Matter, and that was actually the second single off of this album. And again, that was a weird thing because the single from this album was released to compete when the Who, for their new label, for Decca, had just released Substitute. So they were battling it out. Legal Matter only got to the lower end of the charts. Substitute got to number 2, I believe it was. And like I told you, the last track, The Ox, kind of sucks. It's just a waste of time, but it's a great record. This record, by the way, Paul Weller said it's the record that changed his life. He was just blown away by this. And this is what sent him in a completely different direction. He was just a Beatles, a follower of the Beatles and trying to worship the Beatles. And he heard the Who's first album, blown away, changed everything for the guy. I mentioned earlier a couple times, when this record came out, they were done with the mod movement. They were done. And we have to talk about this because the Who has everything to do with fashion, believe it or not, in retrospect. And I'm going to explain why right here. They were done with the mods, and now they're moving into the whole pop art phase. Union Jack jacket, white denim here, scarves, whatnot. Let me explain real quick. Roger put it this way, that when you look at classic mod stuff, or when you're doing that looking back revisionist thing, nostalgic trip at mods, he said originally when the mods were a big deal in England, it was all Italian suits and hush puppies. The classic mods that you see now of like the button-down shirts and the sweaters and clean cut and the nice trousers and shoes, that was actually classic Who. So the mods adopted the way the Who would dress at that time, and it became part of synonymous with the mods, when really that was just the classic Who of that era and the way they dressed. So the Who didn't adopt the mod movement. The mods adopted the Who and the way they dressed. So that's something weird. But Pete was saying he's all about pop art. In his music, in his attitude, he's got to move on, and it's all about art. A funny thing, when they wanted to make this jacket, which, by the way, don't get confused, that's not John's jacket, that is Pete's jacket. But these two jackets are important because in the 60s, when people wanted a white denim jacket, they would say the Keith Moon jacket. And all Keith is doing is wearing a white Levi's jacket. And of course, they would want a Townsend jacket. But the Townsend jacket, actually, I think it was Kit and Pete went and bought a couple Union Jacks and took them to Savile Row and went to some tailors and said, hey, can you make this jacket for me? At this point in time, remember in the early 60s in Britain, no one was going to deface a flag. No one. They were turned away by several tailors who were like, we can't do that. We'll be put in prison. So Pete and his manager had to kind of go find a back alley guy, a cheap, dodgy tailor to make the jacket that would become so famous. And as Roger pointed out, taking the Union Jack and taking that bullseye symbol, which is the Royal Air Force symbol, they were the first to do it and put it out there. They put it on drums, they put it on their amps, they put it on t-shirts, they made jackets out of it. The Union Jack was just a flag before the Who. The Who made it a pop culture, what do you want to say, icon. It's crazy. And even mentioned in punk at this time, when they were into this whole pop art phase, Pete was wearing medals, long before punks did, wearing the armbands and the German Nazi hats. Pete was wearing medals from World War II and stuff. Roger was taking black electrical tape, making designs on his sweaters and on his shirts, long before the punks, way longer before Richie Manic or the Manic Street Preachers did it. They were really innovators fashion-wise, and people don't give them enough credit for that. But one thing the Who do get credit for, or let me rephrase that, one thing the Who does get credit for is smashing guitars. Now, real quick, it was really interesting to hear Roger explain how and why that happened. Remember, I told you earlier the Michelangelo Antonioni, or whatever his name is, who did Blow Up, specifically went to see the Who, to see Pete do this, to put it in his movie, because that was a crazy thing to do. No one was doing that at this time in the mid-60s, right? But it all came about by accident. When the band realized what had happened, though, that's a great thing. Let's do that. And of course, long before Malcolm McLaren, Kit Lambert, and who was the other guy that was the manager, they realized a good thing, and they were like, dude, we're going to take this and milk this, and this is going to make you guys famous. But according to Roger, it all happened in an accident. And it was because Pete, if you look at those old videos, you can see how it comes together. That Pete would be playing, and even on the record, this record is laden with feedback. Pete loved feedback. He wasn't like this kind of guitar player, but big power chords, big power, feedback. And Pete was really into feedback. It's amazing, actually, when you listen to this album, how much of that feedback and just hum and everything is on this record. But that's where Pete was at. So Roger said Pete would go up to the amps while he was playing and grab the amp and like shake it and move it and pull it closer to get feedback for his guitar. But one time when he was doing that, he slipped and he fell, busted a guitar, and the audience went crazy. So immediately the band is like, hey, what just happened? You broke a guitar? Do it again. The management seized on it, everybody seized on it, and it became such a huge thing. Well, Pete wouldn't be Pete without that today, right? Happy Accident turned into a huge, iconic, that's what Pete's known for, right? All because slipped and fell trying to get some feedback. But Roger said that was a big thing. Like, then they seized on that, and they loved smashing equipment. Because remember earlier I said the band had such tension in between them that when they would get on stage, they had to get a release somehow. And that was some sort of release for them. And Roger said that actually everything they had, from mics and guitars and drums, was all kind of patched together anyway and barely held together, like with gaffer tape or whatever, because they kept smashing stuff, and they're like, don't worry about it. We can tape that and rewire that. We'll be good to go for the next show. So that was just normal life for those guys. Another thing, though, even though Pete was known for his smashing, and I keep mentioning this, is feedback. Pete, in the early days, in an interview in 1966 with Record Mirror, which, by the way, Pete and Roger were in the same issue of Record Mirror in 66, and Roger said in 1966 he didn't expect the Who to go on for longer than 3 years. Hope I die before I get old. What? But anyway, Pete said in that same issue, in a different interview, that he was really offended that he wasn't given credit for kind of mastering feedback. And he said that he was really disappointed because people were like overlooking the Who about that and giving it to like the Yardbirds, or I can't remember who else, the Beatles. And he said, that's not so. We were doing it first. And he was the master of feedback, not those other chumps. Great record. 500 is listed as one of the 500 greatest albums of all time. Second greatest guitar album of all time in Mojo Magazine. Q Magazine, top British albums, one of the top British albums of all time. But I just want to read something in closing to kind of put this into perspective. And this is what the Rolling Stone album guide had to say about this record in one of its revised editions in 2004. With its ferocious blend of grungy distortion, rumbling bass and percussion, and brutish vocals, The Who Sings My Generation became the blueprint for much of the subsequent garage rock, heavy metal, and punk. Think about that. Take a listen to this and think about what they said. In contrast to debut albums from the Stones and the Beatles, My Generation positively shoved at the boundaries of popular music. Townsend's fiercely original guitar experiments here predate the innovations of his later American rival Jimi Hendrix. Think about that. He was doing stuff with guitar before Hendrix, before Page, obviously before Lennon and McCartney. Maybe not one of the Davies brothers, Dave Davies, maybe not. But anyway, fantastic. Power, energy, punk, fashion, what more could you want? R&B, maximum R&B, volume-wise as well as energy and sweat-wise. The Who, My Generation, what a record.